How are we doing today? Good? Are we awake yet? I know it's kind of early. I'm awake. I've had 1 cup of coffee, a lot of ATP 360, so we're going to gently wake up together and ease into the day. It's really a pleasure to be back at IMMH. I spoke here, well, we were down in Atlanta, Georgia. This was, I think, 2022. Were any of you there? I felt like I recognized a few people in the crowd. So I see some friendly faces, some new functional friends. I hope to have the opportunity to meet as many of you as possible. But we're going to go ahead and get this started because we have an action-packed hour here talking about some core subjects that are really near and dear to my heart. So before we do, of course, I want to say thank you to Dennis and his team at Research Nutritionals for having me. It's absolutely an honor to represent them and get to share some of really my life's work and my life's journey with you all. So how many of us have ever struggled with our mental health out of curiosity? I know we're all providers, practitioners, but usually, you know, I like to joke that I didn't choose the functional life chose me, right? And so it is through our own pain to purpose journey that usually we get into this line of work, and I'm really no exception. So we're going to be diving deep into a lot of interesting axes with the role of the mitochondria dysfunction in the gut-brain axis. So back in 2022 at IMMH, I actually spoke on the gut-brain axis, so I'm going to be expanding the conversation and looking at the pivotal role of mitochondrial dysfunction and how it's deeply implicated in gut-brain axis perturbations and how this affects neuroimmunology. Now, my background is actually fitness and nutrition, and really it's interesting just how the field has progressed over the years. I feel like medicine and health and fitness has kind of merged in the middle, and that is functional medicine in my opinion. So I like to say I have a background in metabolic medicine, and candidly, if I had to pick only 2 interventions to combat the chronic disease crisis and the mental health crisis, it's going to be fitness and nutrition. And then of course, certainly when people are impaired cognitively or mentally, it can be hard to rebuild those neural networks and adopt those new healthier lifestyle behaviors, which is where targeted nutraceutical intervention can really kickstart the journey, support that neuroplastic remodeling so they can learn the behaviors that they need to master for optimal clinical outcomes. So let's go and dive in. I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I do have the privilege of doing a lot of really cool things in this industry. Above all else, I'm a clinical research and education kind of guy. That's really where my heart is. And so I have developed a number of clinical frameworks and tools for practitioners like yourselves. And I'm really, really passionate about the work that I do because back in my early 20s, I was really struggling with my mental health, even though I was very metabolically fit. I was a personal trainer, nutrition coach, and metabolic technician. So really using lifestyle intervention, and with metabolic technician, that's resting metabolic rate assessment, maximal VO2. I hope to hear a lot more conversation about VO2 as a marker of longevity, not just cardiometabolic health. So certainly, I'm one of those exceptions of, even though I was very metabolically sound, I wasn't mentally sound. And I actually found myself breathing out of a tube in the intensive care unit after I attempted to take my life with an overdose. And that's something I'm pretty candid about. I put it out there not as there's not a whole lot of vulnerability, it's more, that's what happened. That was my lived experience. And so I quite literally experienced firsthand the limitations of the conventional approach to mental health. And I've since dedicated my life and career to pioneering a more functional approach. So with that, these are learning objectives. Of course, we'll do a deep dive into this bidirectional relationship between mitochondrial dysfunction and dysregulation and redox homeostasis perturbations, and how this is really the core mechanism that drives glial activation that we're going to dive deep into. Now, with my background in fitness and nutrition, I could have never predicted that someday my whole career would really center around one specific type of cell in the human body, and that is the innate immune cell of the central nervous system that are microglia. And I would really argue you can't say that you're up to date on the research of mental illness or neurodegeneration without being familiar with the concept of glial activation. So just out of curiosity, how many of us are somewhat familiar with microglial activation neuroimmunology? Amazing, amazing. That wasn't the case even as recent as like 5 years ago. So that field of research has really exploded, and it is sort of the core mechanism and physiological process that underlies and is implicated in virtually every neurodevelopmental, neuropsychiatric, and neurodegenerative disorder. I have not yet found a mental or neural condition that's not directly associated with perturbations in the glial system with our astrocytes and microglia. So of course, my clinical education style, I'm not just going to give you a standardized protocol, which it might work for most people most of the time, but if I give you guys a clinical framework for success that you can replicate over and over, then you can create those bio-individualized protocols to optimize clinical outcomes. Does this all sound good? Good way to start your day? Yeah, okay. Can't spell function without fun, can you? So let's have a good time. Oh man, you don't encourage me too much yet. I'm not even woken up yet. So I don't think any of us would be here if we're not keenly aware of this mental health crisis that's afoot. But I do want to take the time to look at some of these statistics because literally every time I read them, I practiced this talk like 5 times in the past week, and every time I read these, it ignites a fire in my soul that drives the passion for what I do. So when we see that depression affects nearly 350 million plus people worldwide, we see that Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. Suicide was actually the 10th leading cause until COVID kind of booted down the list a little bit, but it's still like the 2nd leading cause of death for young people ages 12 to 34. And having been a suicide attempt survivor myself, it's something I'm very passionate about. Now, I do want to make note, I'm forever grateful for the advancements of modern medicine because I wouldn't be alive today giving this presentation if it wasn't for modern medicine. But when it comes to getting to the root of the mental health crisis, this is where all of us collectively are doing that work. And especially with the dark week we've had in America recently, it just really ignites that passion. There's a lot of layers to the mental health crisis. And in fact, I thought, it might be kind of fun. I have these t-shirts. This is my brand, my logo. So it's this brain yin-yang. And really what this is meant to symbolize is our mental health is more than the sum of our cellular processes. It's this complex, intricate input of the psychological input signals and the physiological, right? The psychosomatic axis, I like to say thoughts become proteins, but our physiology also directly impacts our psychology, our neurology. So this is all the work that I do. I think it's time to redefine mental illness as mental health dysfunction. So I thought I'd share that with you guys. Does anybody appreciate the sentiment, the rhetoric, maybe a little bit? Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, redefine a little bit here. So with that background in metabolic medicine, we have to recognize that, of course, that chronic disease epidemic, the metabolic crisis is raging concomitantly. And certainly, we know that association doesn't equal causation, but I think it would be kind of foolhardy to not acknowledge how disrupted metabolic health is a major driver of mental health perturbations and cognitive decline and dementia. I think we've all heard Alzheimer's being referred to as a type 3 diabetes, which I think is a little simplistic. Yes, neuronal insulin resistance is deeply implicated in Alzheimer's, but there's a lot of other factors that play into that we're going to explore today. But when we look at the fact that only about 12% of Americans are considered metabolically healthy, and if you look at that study from 2020, I think we could raise the bar on our standard of metabolic health. We see that about 70% of the American population is overweight or obese, about half the population is insulin resistant or diabetic. So we have a lot of lifestyle foundation work to do in intelligent supplementation, so that way we're not over-relying on synthetic pharmaceuticals, of course. So to illustrate that point further, these are some obesity trends and suicide rates, obviously a positive correlation from 1990 to 2018 for the obesity rates going up and up and up. I'm a 90s baby, 92, so in my lifetime I've certainly seen this up and coming, and we've really hit this precipice of what are we going to do about this. I was having some dialogue with some loved colleagues yesterday, and it really saddens me of there's so few of us and so many millions of Americans that don't really know that we exist or industry exists. I always say that functional medicine isn't very functional if nobody can access it or afford it. So it's up to us to disseminate this evidence-based interventions and effectively coach our clients and patients to optimal health and the quality of life that they deserve. So this is how I define what I call the standard American metabolism. I'm a visual learner, so I make all my own graphics here. So it just so happens to spell this kind of fun little acronym of SAM. So Uncle Sam isn't really living his best life currently. And so when we look at some of these major characteristics of the adiposity, the insulin resistance, the metabolic associated fatty liver disease, methylation dysfunction, hypertension, the list goes on and on and on. A lot of times I'll preach that the 3 pillars of mental health, in my opinion, are mindset, which we could have a long conversation about, metabolism, the engine of your soul, if you will, and the microbiota, the garden of life that actually develops your neuroimmune tone early in life, even in utero, as we'll get into. So we know excess body fat isn't just a storage vessel for palmitic acid when we eat too much ultra-processed food, right? But it's actually an endocrine gland, and it's secreting a lot of pro-inflammatory mediators, the interleukin-6. We get rises in insulin and leptin, decreases in adiponectin. Clinical pearl, does anybody like to look at the leptin-adiponectin ratio in your clients or patients? Oh, okay, a couple. Let's boost that up to next year. We'll get like a full room. This is really what got me into lab testing, literally when I was 18 years old as personal trainer and nutrition coach, because all my clients were just general middle-class Americans in the Midwest looking to lose a little weight, get a little healthier, feel a little bit better in their body and their clothes, right? But of course, with weight loss and compliance, how do they want to measure success? Well, they want to see the number on the scale going down, but that's such a crude metric of health, right? So even back then, I was like, well, let's use blood work and very specific biomarkers reflective of their internal physiology. And so the leptin-adiponectin ratio is perhaps one of the most sensitive indicators of overall metabolic health. And so if you track that over the course of time, you can see how their efforts are really paying off, and you're gonna get changes in those biomarkers long before the scale changes, long before they feel different in their clothes. And with the way the neurolimbic system has evolved, our brain is basically going to encourage something that's getting us results and discourage the behaviors that aren't really getting us anywhere. So a lot of this is based on subjective perception. If your patient or client doesn't subjectively perceive a benefit from doing your fancy protocol, working out hard in the gym, or complying with that diet, their neurolimbic system's like, why would I do this anymore? So we have to be able to objectively prove to them, hey, you don't have to be an A+ student to pass. Even a B-level effort, you'll still get positive changes in your physiology. So I often preach we have to make sure we're tracking physiology more than we're chasing root causes. Yes, let's explore root cause etiological factors, but more importantly, let's track their physiology using clinically validated biomarkers so we can objectively prove that our methods are working. And that's really what drives my passion for research. We need a lot more real-world data to prove that our methodology works. We know it works. We're the practitioners. We're the clinicians. But we need to prove to the world that it works, and we need the data to support that. So I think it's important for all of us to be familiar with some of the leading theories of mental illness, because most of America is familiar with kind of the brain chemical imbalance theory, which is really the monoamine theory developed in the 50s and 60s. And while that model is not at all inaccurate, it's very incomplete. And in a large way, the brain chemical imbalance has become almost pharma marketing rhetoric, right? You know, this idea of like, well, mental illness, it happens because you have a brain chemical imbalance. We don't know why it happens. There's not really anything you can do about it. So here's a synthetic pharmaceutical to modulate your neurotransmitter systems to stabilize you and manage your symptoms, right? So we have to be looking at the full picture, and certainly if we want to be functional or holistic, we can't ignore any of the puzzle pieces. So when we look at some of the more modern theories of mental health dysfunction, looking at the neurotrophic factors, these neuroprotective proteins like BDNF as the best characterized and most popular, NGF, so on and so forth, and how these neurotrophic factors are contributing to neuroregeneration, neuroplasticity, and neurogenesis, so we can rewire our brain essentially and build new neural architects more associated with the path and trajectory that we want to be on to get that health outcome that we desire. Looking at the cytokine or inflammation theory, looking at how pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory pleiotropic cytokines, and how does this alter our neurotransmitter systems, our cognition, and mental health. The gut-brain axis is its own whole theory that we're going to be diving deeper into today, or of course then the mitochondrial component with the intracellular biochemistry and how that dictates neuroimmune tone and morphology, as we'll get further into. The neuroendocrine, allostatic, HPA that we're all familiar with, glutamate hypothesis, epigenetics, and then the connectome. So with the body of work that I do, I try to make sure I'm not leaving any of the puzzle pieces out, right? And then all the while, we have to meet the patient where they're at and really cultivate positive psychology. So often our physiology is gonna trail behind our mindset and our psychology. So this is essentially my working theory and statement that I'll probably spend the rest of my life validating, but I would say that mental illness is largely, maybe not exclusively, but largely an epigenetic phenomenon driven by oxidative stress, inflammation, and neuroendocrine dysregulation. Now, I have a whole clinical framework I teach practitioners through my institute, but simply and succinctly, in my opinion, if there is measurable objective neuroinflammation, that becomes the top priority. We're not going to really get too far until we put out the fire in their central nervous system. Now, in many ways, if there is not elevated neuroinflammation, we don't have to guess. We have amazing objective biomarkers and tests that we can use to quantify the degree of neuroinflammation, microglial activation, blood-brain barrier permeability, and neuronal damage. So I quantify this. Now, if somebody doesn't really have excess neuroinflammation, then it's usually going to be more ground zero with the gut microbiota, the neuroendocrine pathways, and metabolic pathways. But again, this is where using our testing so we can objectively assess, well, which physiological domains do we really need to focus our protocol and intervention efforts here? Okay, microglial activation 101. Let's talk about it. So I might be the first person ever to brand and trademark microglia, and it's something I am actually quite proud of, but this is a good simplistic diagram to start with. So these microglia, they're only making up about 10 to 15% of our brain cell population. So while their population quantity is rather small, their impact on our mental and neural health throughout our lifespan is quite profound. I would actually argue that if we care about our brain health in utero, neurodevelopmental years, our adult years, and then as we're aging through inflammaging and immunosenescence or neuroimmunosenescence, it is these microglia that are the stars in that show, which is why everything that I do is focused on, well, what is altering the activity of these microglia? Because they're highly dynamic cells that originally scientists thought that these were monocytes, hematopoietic bone marrow origin monocytes that had migrated into the parenchyma or functional tissue of the central nervous system, but then they figured out, well, actually, no, these are completely different cells with different cellular origins arising from the yolk sac and early embryogenesis. So I like to refer to the microglia as the guardians and the architects of the central nervous system. It is largely the microglia that are developing our neural networks in utero. So we could have a whole separate lecture on the metabolic and microbiota status of the mother and father to be and how that's directly influencing neuroimmune development in utero in the fetus. Now, using myself as kind of an anecdotal N of 1, I was actually born via C-section, and we all know, right, we're not going to get inoculated with all those beneficial microbes in the bifidobacterium. I was also a purple baby. I must have been extremely hypoxic. That might explain why I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and ADHD when I was 21. I don't know, it's subjective. I'm just connecting a few clinical dots for you guys. But depending on the input signals that these microglia receive, they can either be neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory with their M2 phenotype, or they can be pro-inflammatory and cytotoxic and essentially neurodegenerative through their M1 phenotype. Now, taking this a little bit further, this is my more comprehensive diagram to illustrate this point. So under normal physiological conditions, our microglia should be quiescent. Usually they're referred to as inactive or resting, but they're not really inactive. They're patrolling their local environment within your central nervous system. So even during the hour of me giving this talk, all of your microglia are going to patrol their respective region in your brain at least once, if not twice, to make sure there's not any foreign invaders, not any tissue remodeling that needs to occur. So I think we've all seen the movie, the Matrix, the original Matrix movie with the robotic squid things that are going after Neo and his friends. That's kind of like what these microglia are doing. And so then if they detect a threat, what do? They puff up like a cobra. They turn into this M1 phenotype. They become highly glycolytic and anaerobic, so they're sugar burning, and they start blasting pro-inflammatory oxidative mediators and missiles. They express inducible nitric oxide synthase, so they're creating large magnitudes of nitric oxide gas that, normally nitric oxide is kind of a miracle molecule, but excess INOS expression from immune or neuroimmune activation can be very damaging to our central nervous system and drive inflammation and damage to our neuronal tissues, right? Now, in contrast, the M2 phenotype, being very neuroprotective, it's releasing BDNF and neurotrophic factors and anti-inflammatory factors to remodel the tissues, right? Now, scientists used to think that it was a little bit more black and white. It's either they're M1 or M2, but since then we've discovered, well, they are such dynamic cells, they can be a little bit of both at the same time. And there's actually sub-activation states. So there's M1A, M1B, M1C, M2A, M2B, M2C. There's dark microglia, senescent microglia, lipopolysaccharide tolerant microglia. Because otherwise, if you got sepsis, you would very quickly develop brain inflammation and probably die. So when the microglia are exposed to lipopolysaccharide, they have a hormetic response and can become more tolerant, so that way if they're exposed to more endotoxin, they don't have an excessively pro-inflammatory destructive activation state. And so all of my work is studying, well, what input signals are going to alter the morphology and activity of these microglia? And so this is a rather consolidated and succinct list. It's not exhaustive. There's a lot of different mediators or even biomarkers that we can look at that are known to activate and disturb and propagate these neuroimmune cells. So most of our clients and patients are going to have at least one or two or three, if not like the whole list. So let's run through this real quick. Of course, for some, it's going to be the hyperglycemia, the insulin resistance, the advanced glycation end products, ceramides and free fatty acids or unconjugated bilirubin from a fatty congested liver. For somebody else, it might be anemia that nobody has identified. I get a lot of mothers concerned about their teenage or children that come to my practice, and recently we had a mother who had a teenage daughter struggling with severe OCD. And she was like, well, you know, all the Instagram content, I think it's a stealth infection. So I want to do, you know, the tick-borne 2.0, I want to test for Lyme and co-infections. I'm like, well, why don't we start with assessing the physiology before we spend $2,000 on that test and look for a stealth infection through serology? And really, when I'm looking at her blood work, there's really no evidence of immune activation or disturbances or even inflammation, but what was very obvious was anemia that nobody had apparently looked at, driving a hypoxic state, low oxygen tension, which drives oxidative stress and inflammation in the brain. So we have to be very objective and not get too caught up in the chasing the root causes. Let's assess the physiology first and see what tale does that tell, right? But maybe it's pro-inflammatory cytokines. How many of our clients and patients are walking around with a C-reactive protein of 3 to 7 all the time? We know that C-reactive protein disturbs the blood-brain barrier. We know it activates microglia. We know that the microglia can produce C-reactive protein locally in the central nervous system. And that's just good old-fashioned CRP. That's like a, $10 biomarker. And then we have so many more sophisticated markers to get even more specific and granular. Toxins, metals, the glyphosate, the EMFs, the xenobiotics, the metals, we all know this. That toxic burden is certainly contributing to neuroimmune dysregulation. It's been implicated in schizophrenia and a wide array of other conditions. Now, this one always throws people off, the heat or cold stress. So, you know, people on social media are like, well, are you saying that sauna and cold plunging isn't good for you? And it's like, well, the hormetic dose kind of makes the medicine or the poison, right? So even just a week ago, I did some hot heated vinyasa yoga, kind of a more vigorous yoga, which I think is one of the best forms of exercise in my opinion. And I was doing the cold plunge. And after about 2 minutes, you don't really feel the cold, right? It's almost more like a burn, kind of icy hot. So I sat in there for like 6 minutes. It's like, I could do this all day. But I was like, well, I don't want to overdo it. There is such a thing as too much heat shock protein activation, cold shock protein activation. I felt kind of lousy the next day. So contrast therapy, I'm all for it, but hormesis is the name of the game. So let's not overdo it because that could be a stressor in its own right. Nutrient status, the fact that our population is overfed yet malnourished. How does that even happen? Modern America, apparently. But then also trauma, of course, big T, little t, adverse childhood events that can change our methylation DNA patterns that alters neuroendocrine tone and neuroimmune tone through neurodevelopment and set the stage for developing neuropsychiatric predispositions later in life. So the list goes on, and it's kind of a checkbox that we have to work through using our objective biomarkers along with our clinical intake to navigate this as efficaciously as possible. So this is my favorite diagram I've ever made. All of my work really centers around this, so obviously looking at the microglial activation, the blood-brain barrier permeability, and leaky brain, and I want to give you guys some real juicy clinical pearls. I'm very lab testing passionate. The deeper I get into my career, the more strongly I feel about objectivity. I would love to maybe do another talk someday about the psychosomatic axis and how quite literally the thoughts that we're cultivating and leaning into are directly influencing our physiology. And I spend countless hours pondering, you know, is this more physiological in origin, psychological in origin? It's always going to be that intricate mix of both, which is what that brain yin-yang diagram is supposed to illustrate. Now, with some of these biomarkers, and I do have a test that I'll teach you about momentarily, when we have blood-brain barrier permeability, of course, the floodgates are open. The endotoxins, the heavy metals, the food antigens, pro-inflammatory cytokines, all of these things getting into the parenchyma of the central nervous system and altering neuroimmune activity. So then when we have excessive M1 polarization, think of it this way. Over the course of whether it's a week, a year, or a lifetime, how often are those microglia as a cell population excessively polarized into that cytotoxic pro-inflammatory M1 phenotype? That's the name of the game. We need to restore homeostasis. Now, obviously, if I pick up a viral infection on my flight home, for example, and that virus is trying to infect my brain, well, gosh, I want the microglia to go into their M1 phenotype to fight off the foreign invader. But we should have resolution once the foreign invader has been destroyed and eliminated, and then we have to have adequate M2 to fix the damage that was done. Now, part of the problem with neuroinflammation, it's a bit of a fire that can keep itself going. So even if the initial trigger of the microglial activation has been removed, that doesn't mean the fire has been put out, right? So yes, let's eliminate the initial trigger and make sure that we're altering the terrain to produce more of a neurotrophic anti-inflammatory environment, but we still have to actually combat the flames and neutralize the fire, because otherwise what's happening is all those pro-inflammatory mediators, the interleukin-1 beta, IL-6, TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, high mobility group OX1 protein, matrix, metalloproteinase 9, all of these. Now there's some key biomarkers right here that we can measure. We can measure quinolinic acid on an organic acids test. We can measure myeloperoxidase, which is a very overlooked pro-inflammatory vascular oxidative biomarker, or neopterin. We're going to talk about that one, so I'm making a little clinical note here. So when we have this excess neuroinflammation and we're experiencing neuronal damage, well then those damage-associated molecular patterns from the damaged neurons are binding onto pattern recognition receptors on the glia that then drive more M1 activity, right? So it can become a vicious cycle. And if left unchecked, what happens? Neurodegeneration. Really, we could simplistically say chronic neuroinflammation equals and causes neurodegeneration. So it is the glia that are the main things that we have to be focusing if we're trying to do anything about this epidemic. Now, to further make this point about why I don't think the monoamine theory and the brain chemical imbalance theory is sufficient unto itself, I think most of us know about the kynurenine IDO1 pathway, I would imagine, but there's another pathway that runs parallel, biochemically speaking, not that biochemistry runs in these simplistic diagrams that our monkey minds can comprehend, but metaphorically speaking, we have the kynurenine pathway and then the GTPCH1 pathway. So indolamine 2,3-dioxygenase 1, or IDO1, is expressed by all these different cell types, the microglia, macrophages that have maybe migrated up into the brain through a leaky blood-brain barrier, the neurons, oligodendrocytes, so on and so forth. Now, under normal physiological conditions, the IDO1 enzyme is going to be consuming about 90 to 95% of our body's tryptophan. Only about 5 to 10% is going into our serotonin-melatonin pathway, our feel-good hormone pathway, right? So when we have excess inflammation in the periphery or the brain, we have all these inducing factors, lipopolysaccharide being the best characterized, amyloid beta, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and it upregulates the activity of the IDO1 enzyme and dysregulates the enzymes that basically control, are we producing kynurenic acid, which is neuroprotective and an NMDA receptor antagonist, or are we yielding quinolinic acid, which is neurotoxic and excitotoxic and destroys our blood-brain barrier and promotes neuroinflammation. Now, ironically, the whole point of this kynurenine pathway is to actually produce NAD. We all love NAD. I can't believe how popular NAD has gotten as a supplement. And our body produces adequate levels endogenously under normal physiological conditions. So this is where the organic acids can come in helpful. We can measure urine levels of kynurenic acid, quinolinic, which I will say is more reflective of peripheral macrophage activation because it's in the urine, not quite as related to the central nervous system, but it's a pooling, so there could be CNS contribution. Now, the other pathway that essentially runs parallel, like literally we could plot the same pathway on the same diagram, is GTPCH1, or guanosine triphosphate cyclohydrolase 1. Say that 3 times fast. Now with this, it's the same inducing factors, and it has the same disturbances where we should be producing adequate levels of biopterin, or BH4, a major cofactor for nitric oxide, serotonin, dopamine, but when we have this pro-inflammatory milieu and microenvironment, it dysregulates that enzyme and we get less biopterin, which of course we need to make our feel-good neurotransmitters nitric oxide, and instead we get neopterin, which is that biomarker I mentioned on this last slide. So you can measure neopterin in the serum, amazing marker of macrophage and microglial activation. And then galectin-3, how many of us use galectin-3? It's kind of a more popular one, especially with the A4M crowd. Okay, that's okay. So if you look at the galectin-3 and the neopterin in the blood, neopterin is more reflective of M1, galectin-3 is more reflective of M2. So if you're measuring both in the blood, you can get some insight into, is my immune system skewed more towards this pro-inflammatory phenotype or anti-inflammatory phenotype? And then we can track those biomarkers over time to see how our interventions are working. All right, moving this along. Are we with me? I know I cover a lot of ground, talk fast, there's a lot of mechanisms, but I will bring it all together, I promise. So this is why in 2019 I developed my own lab test called the Mental Map. Kind of proud of the branding because, like, you know, it's your mental map to better mental health. But MAP is also an acronym that stands for Microglial Activation Profile. Nailed it, right? Trademark, good. So essentially my main objective with this lab panel was I really wanted to use the most clinically validated markers of glial activation, neuroinflammation, neuronal damage, and at the same time casting a broad net to widely assess their physiology, looking at kidney function or insulin resistance or leptin and adiponectin ratios, methylation dysfunction, so on and so forth. So I literally built a whole training program around the mental map. I use the mental map with all my clients. I teach providers how to use it. So it's a composite custom panel with a lot of the best biomarkers, including neurofilament light chain, if anybody's using that one for neuronal damage, glial fibrillary acidic protein as a marker of astrocyte activation, and so much more. So of course, once we have our objective data, the question is, what do we do about it, right? So this is where the first product I want to introduce you guys to is the Cytoquel from Research Nutritionals. I always have it on hand. I take it literally weekly, especially when I'm really sore and achy from a hard leg day or a hard gym session, right? But the Cytoquel is a really sophisticated formula to balance our cytokine activity between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory, featuring a lot of classic ingredients that we know and love, very efficacious raw ingredients, including N-acetylcysteine, black tea extract, turmeric, delta gold tocotrienols, resveratrol, and so much more to start modulating the cytokine-chemokine milieu, right? We can't blame the cells or the microglia of like, oh, the microglia are being dysfunctional. They're just responding to the microenvironment and the cytokine milieu. So if we want to change the morphology and the activity of the glia, we have to alter the terrain in the environment, right? So the very first thing that I want to do when I am seeing elevated neuroinflammation in their mental map results is start to fight the fire and then start supporting the neurotrophic activity. So Cytoquel is one of the first things I'll start titrating in to promote antioxidative pathways, anti-inflammatory pathways. Now, Research Nutritionals did an 8-week open label study. This was published in the Journal of Pain Research in 2019 with participants with long-standing physical discomfort, and they assessed for pain, sleep, cytokine, and vascular markers. So some of the key findings that they saw in their study was a 65% reduction in physical discomfort at 8 weeks, a 44% improvement in sleep quality, a 9.6 reduction in matrix metalloproteinase 9, which is associated with a leaky brain, by the way. It's not an exclusively leaky brain marker, but it can infer that to some extent. Also a normalization of the ankle brachial index, a vascular parameter looking at how well we can perfuse blood throughout the body. And also reductions in interleukin-1 receptor antagonists, tumor necrosis factor alpha, von Willebrand factor, and fibrinogen levels. So improvement in vascular and inflammatory parameters here with this formulation. So this is a good summary slide and a picture of the Journal of Pain Research that was published in. So in conclusion, consuming Cytoquel helped manage pain, increase comfort during daily activities, and improved blood biomarkers associated with inflammation and vascular health. So very first thing, let's start fighting the fire. The second step, let's promote neurotrophic activity, right? Especially, I don't know about you all, I've worked extensively in the mold, Lyme co-infections, complex chronic illness space, which is a complicated space to navigate, to say the least. I'll spare you all the tangent. But with this, we have to be supporting the neurotrophic activity to combat the neurological deficits. A lot of these individuals might be too ill to immediately jump into an exercise regimen, right? I've been a fitness person forever, my whole life, started my career that way. But what if they're not quite ready to exercise? What if they don't have the cognitive capacity to apply themselves with the nutrition or with the lifestyle behaviors, right? This is where therapeutic supplementation can really kickstart their healing journey. So I love the BDNF Essentials. As the name would imply, it's all about promoting brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which I would say, based on the state of the literature, is really kind of the superhero molecule when it comes to mental health. More than serotonin, more than others, BDNF promotion is really the name of the game. Now, originally, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, they thought it was just brain-derived, hence the name. But then later, scientists figure out, you know what also produces BDNF? Your skeletal muscle. So maybe that exercise and producing that as a secondary name of metabokine, right? So we can promote BDNF activity using BDNF Essentials, which features two major synergistic blends, the neurocytoprotect, including lion's mane, the thinking mushroom. I'm a big fan of mushrooms, both psychedelic and non-psychedelic. So lion's mane is a great one to include. Classic bacopa for focus and cognitive clarity. Ashwagandha that we all know and love. Along with this cognition blend that features CDB-choline, which has some great anti-inflammatory properties, and phosphatidylserine that can modulate our HPA axis and neuroendocrine pathways. So it will support neuroplasticity and neuroprotective mechanisms and neuroregenerative pathways, as well as balancing redox homeostasis by activating NRF2. So this is a really great kind of 1-2 punch when we're starting to combat the fire and try to get the neurotrophic factors back online. Now, Research Nutritionals did an open-label exploratory study in healthy adults with self-reported memory concerns using the BDNF Essentials as the intervention for 8 weeks. This was published in Current Nutraceuticals in 2023, and some of the exciting key findings included a 41% improvement in immediate word recall, a 13% increase in visual memory, 10% reduction in salivary cortisol. They saw reductions in interleukin-6, of course, which is that major pro-inflammatory cytokine that we all love and hate at the same time, secreted by excess body fat, certainly, driving C-reactive protein complement activation, major cytokine for neuroinflammation. They also saw improvements in mood metrics, including an 18% reduction in confusion and bewilderment, as well as a 12% reduction in depression dejection. So picture of the journal, but in conclusion, BDNF Essentials improved reaction times and measures of working memory, episodic memory, and attention, reduced biomarkers of stress and cytokine activity, and improved mood and sleep. Sleep is sacred. If there's one thing that messes with my cognitive mental health faster than anything else, it's gonna be sleep. Now, ironically, acute sleep deprivation can have an antidepressant effect. Chronic sleep deprivation, not so much. Now, moving this along, let's talk about mitochondria, right? The powerhouse of all of our cells, including the microglia. So I actually did a webinar with Research Nutritionals all about mitochondria. And they are really the biochemical intracellular sensors that dictate the cellular dynamic and activity. So quite literally, you could go as far to say that the mitochondrial dysfunction in a lot of ways is the first domino to fall that then tells the microglia to activate into their M1 morphology. Now remember, the M2 phenotype is using oxidative phosphorylation to produce anti-inflammatory mediators. So what happens if we have mitochondrial dysfunction and excess oxidative and nitrosative mediators? We're really not able to fuel the M2 phenotype. We get excess polarization to that pro-inflammatory M1 phenotype. So as soon as I'm starting to quench the fire and support the neurotrophic factors, I immediately want to turn my attention to the mitochondria to get those firing again. So I would never suggest that we can supplement our way out of poor lifestyle habits, of course. So we have to make sure we're effectively coaching our clients and patients to adopt the lifestyle behaviors. Of course, base training for aerobic-based training, walking briskly through nature is certainly medicinal in its own right, but also high lactate training, boosting their anaerobic threshold, which is what we're doing with maximum VO2 assessments. In my opinion, one of the best biomarkers, if you will, of longevity. I'm a metabolic technician. That was one of my favorite things to do in my previous career before I got into functional medicine. But the resistance training, yes, muscle is medicine, believe it or not, sleep hygiene, circadian alignment, and so much more. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so we don't need to spend too much time, but lifestyle as medicine first and foremost. That's what our methodology is contingent on. But to kickstart this, we can really give the spark plug to the mitochondria with the ATP 360, which is a really comprehensive mitochondrial support product from Research Nutritionals that combines a lot of our classic mitochondrial nutrients like coenzyme Q10, NADH, PQQ, phospholipids, acetyl L-carnitine, tocotrienols, and B vitamins to support oxidative phosphorylation, mitogenesis, along with our exercise and sunlight that will stimulate more mitophagy and mitogenesis, and of course, optimizing the membrane of the mitochondria and balancing cytokine signaling. I did pop 3 of these this morning because we were at dinner last night and I was starting to get a little tired, so I'm like, I need to be sharp. I need my ATP online so I can give this talk, not make a fool of myself. So, how are we doing so far? We're getting there. We're diving deep. Yeah, oh man, you guys are way too nice. Okay, we're good. So looking at this clinical study summary that Research Nutritionals did, looking at the ATP 360 as the sole intervention. This was published in Alternative Therapies in Health and Medicine 2021. Some of the key findings, I love these. 52% reduction in fatigue at 1 week that sustained through 8 weeks. Now, I don't know about you all, but the fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, depression, apathy, anhedonia, maybe even bedridden, they might have MCAS and biotoxin illness, mold exposure, who knows? There could be a lot of things going on as part of that chronic disease, chronic complex illness sequelae, right? So immediately, if we can give them more energy so they can do the things we need them to do to get well, so a 52% reduction in fatigue at 1 week, sustained through 8 weeks is pretty impressive to me. And look at that p-value. I love a low p-value. 68% improvement in sleep quality, obviously optimizing their circadian rhythm, their REM cycles, a 31% improvement in mental functioning, 19% reduction in tumor necrosis factor alpha. Who needs Humira? We don't need that. We can reduce it with some ATP 360 and mitochondrial support. 12% reduction in diastolic blood pressure, and even improvements in mitochondrial membrane potential. So a good summary with the graphics that show all these amazing improvements in the journal that it was published in. Now, we can't talk about redox homeostasis without talking about our chief antioxidant, that is the tripeptide glutathione. Now, I've tried a lot of liposomal glutathiones in my day, kind of the eggy, sulfur, fishy thing going on. Doesn't do it for me, but not only is this the most shelf-stable and chemically stable glutathione on the market, it's easily the best tasting. I'm obsessed with the watermelon, it's nostalgic. It's like the Laffy Taffy that I ate as a kid. So I enjoy taking the liposomal Trifortify every single day. I love the watermelon. The orange is also great, but it's very heat stable and is shown to actually increase natural killer cell cytotoxicity by 400% in this open label pilot study at Penn State College of Medicine. It was a 4-week study looking at 12 healthy adults randomized into either 500 milligrams of Trifortify daily or 1,000 milligrams. They also saw a 28% increase in red blood cell glutathione levels, a 25% reduction in lipid peroxidation, no more malondialdehyde, as measured by 8-isoprostane, a 60% increase in lymphocyte proliferation, and positive changes were observed as early as week 1 and sustained over the 4-week study. So hands down, my favorite glutathione on the market. I use it with myself and all of my clients. Here's a picture of the journal if you want to read the full journal, which I would encourage you all to do. Now, one that I think gets overlooked is the molecular hydrogen. Does anybody use molecular hydrogen in their practice? A few of us, okay. See, this is what I mean. I think it gets overlooked a little bit. I'll tell you what, the H2 Absorb, I travel with it always. I don't like airports and airplanes, the jet fumes and people coughing all over me. I always feel kind of cruddy when I get to the hotel rooms, right? So I got in on Wednesday. First thing I do, I kick my legs up the wall to get the drainage going, and I pop a couple effervescent H2 tabs and sip on that. It can reduce blood pressure, something to be aware of because it's acting on the guanylate cyclase enzyme, same enzyme that nitric oxide is acting upon to induce smooth muscle relaxation in the endothelium, causing vasodilation. So if you're using PDE5 inhibitors or nitric oxide support, just be aware that the molecular hydrogen can contribute to that. But it brings me back to life. I kind of perk up again. I feel a little bit more like myself after a long day of travel. So certainly something good to have on hand if you need a little extra redox support. And its ability to selectively scavenge the worst radicals is what I think is really interesting and unique. So it goes after the superoxide, the peroxynitrite, the hydroxyl radical in particular. So certainly a beneficial thing to keep in your toolkit. Now, just for the sake of time, I want to make sure we cover some good gut-brain axis content here. So this is one of my favorite diagrams I've created. And if you can memorize this, you will master the gut-brain axis. So let's take a look here. Now, obviously, a lot of Americans and individuals across the world might be having this standard American gut, right? Leaky, dysbiotic, low diversity, lacking keystone species, low short-chain fatty acid production. So we have a degraded mucosal barrier, a leaky intestinal lining in our tight junctions not being so tight. So we get all of this pathogen-associated molecular pattern translocation, lipopolysaccharide from gram-negative bacteria, proteobacteria phyla, kind of being the best characterized. Now, clinical pearl, and this is what I'm illustrating here. In neuroinflammation research, lipopolysaccharide is the most commonly used activator of the glia. So if they're doing an in vitro cell culture model, they'll take immortalized microglia and expose them to lipopolysaccharide to induce the M1 phenotype. And then they'll be like, oh, well, what drug or supplement can we now administer to undo that and shift them back to either quiescent or their M2 phenotype. So this is a really important clinical pearl, and why the gut-brain axis is so important is obviously if we have excess metabolic endotoxemia and too much endotoxin translocation, kind of like a subclinical sepsis, if you will, that'll drive activation of the macrophages in the periphery to that M1 phenotype, as well as the M1 phenotype in the microglia and the central nervous system if the lipopolysaccharide gets that far, right? Now, in contrast, an adequate, diverse microbiota, adequate keystone species are Akkermansia muciniphila, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii as a major butyrate producer, Roseburia, so on and so forth. When we have adequate levels of butyrate to not only heal and seal the colonocytes, but also to go to the liver, through the liver, into the periphery, and even to the brain, the butyrate has the exact opposite effect as lipopolysaccharide and promotes the M2 phenotype that then is releasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, nerve growth factor, interleukin-10, anti-inflammatory cytokine. So this is why I'm always saying the microbiota is one of the three major pillars of mental health. The question is, over the span of, again, a week, a year, or a lifetime, how much butyrate is your microbiota or your patient's microbiota producing in that time frame? If we don't get that constant drip of butyrate into our body, into our brain, this is going to alter neuroimmune tone chronically, potentially, driving that microglial activation syndrome, if you will. So the more that we can do to diversify the terrain and promote adequate phyla ratios, we often see a high firmicutes to bacteroidetes ratio, a high proteobacteria to actinobacteria ratio. I've looked at countless stool tests, all the different stool tests from all the different providers. I've used all of them. They're all great. Not getting into that. But I can't tell you how many times people will have no detectable levels of a lot of these major keystone species, including the Faecalibacterium, the Akkermansia, Oxalobacter formigenes, Bifidobacterium longum, so on and so forth, right? So the more we can diversify the terrain, get the alpha diversity, the absolute quantity of species detected in that sample, so we can heal and seal the gut and alter the gut-brain axis in our favor. So of course, some lifestyle foundations. I don't think I need to spend too much time on preaching to the choir, but we do know exercise does promote microbiota diversity. It promotes vagal tone. Of course, a microbiota-friendly diet, lots of polyphenols and bioflavonoids, resistant starches. I ate a banana right before coming here. Bananas are great with a little bit more green, also a little 5-HTP in there, get the serotonin going, stress reduction, circadian alignment, and so much more. Now, Research Nutritionals, they had their Renew Gut that they reformulated into Renew Gut Thrive this year, and I'm kind of obsessed with this product. So they were kind enough to send me a bottle to try, and I love it because it's a really sophisticated 3-in-1 product. So we have a tight junction enhancer with collagen peptides types 1 and 3, N-acetyl D-glucosamine, DGL, zinc carnosine, which zinc carnosine is an amazing nutraceutical for the intestinal lining, and getting some zinc that actually promotes BDNF as well. Could talk about that another time. But there's also a mast cell manager. So going back real quick to this diagram, there's a lot of mast cells that reside in the lamina propria underneath our colonocytes and on the other side of the intestines. A lot of mast cells, dendritic cells, we have the Peyer's patches, so on and so forth. So in a lot of ways, the first domino might be the dysbiotic leaky gut, but then the second domino is then all of that mast cell and immune activation that you're getting at the lamina propria level. So this is why Research Nutritionals included the mast cell stabilizers in the Renew Gut Thrive. So we have the tight junction enhancers to heal and seal, but also the mast cell stabilization with the luteolin and black cumin here. And then we have the immunometabolic booster. I get really excited about this, the tributyrin, which I had never heard of until I got a bottle of this Renew Gut Thrive. So the tributyrate is a probutyrate drug. It's basically a butyrate triglyceride. So 3 butyrate molecules in triglyceride form, and it's shown to reach the colonocytes intact more effectively and efficaciously than something like a sodium butyrate. So we have this probutyrate drug, which is going to promote BDNF and the M2 phenotype and everything we've been talking about for this past hour, along with that breakthrough probiotic Akkermansia muciniphila, which has become kind of all the rage in the probiotic world, right? Now, I've gone pretty deep into the research on Akkermansia probiotics, and I have a Word document that's like 50 pages of just Akkermansia research. And there are some lines of evidence that suggest the pasteurized may be more effective and efficacious than the live probiotic strain. And Dennis and his team were obviously savvy to this because they went with the pasteurized Akkermansia, which of course we love to support our mucosal barrier, but also because of its GLP-1 promoting effects. So let's take a closer look at some of the benefits with, of course, the mucosal barrier support so we can regenerate the mucin 1 and 2 layers. It's a microbiome keystone species ecosystem leader. It promotes anti-inflammatory signaling. It balances metabolic resilience with enhancing GLP-1 and incretin responses, as well as helping with glucose disposal and insulin sensitivity. Now, to take this a little step further, we can skip that one. GLP-1 obviously has been all the rage with the rise of Ozempic and the popularity of the GLP-1 receptor agonists. But GLP-1 is also made locally in the brain. It's even made by the microglia. And actually, this was funny. I was having a conversation with ChatGPT, ChatDaddy, earlier this year. And I was like, hey, you know, can you confirm that microglia can produce GLP-1? It's like, no, it doesn't. I'm like, I don't believe you, ChatDaddy. So I go to the research, and sure enough. So then I plugged it in. I'm like, I hope you integrate this so that the rest of the world, when they ask you that question, they'll know better, right? So either way, the GLP-1 is neuroprotective in the brain. And I'm not so much interested in the GLP-1 peptides and drugs. I'm more interested in supporting their endogenous levels. And so the Akkermansia can support that endogenous production of the GLP-1, which is very neuroprotective and neuroregenerative. Now, as we round this out here, we've talked about MCAS a little bit. I did a whole blog series actually this year on the crosstalk between the microglia and the mast cells. In a lot of ways, the mast cells are kind of the first line of defense immunologically speaking, where our tissues are interfacing with the external environment. So a lot of times the mast cell activation precedes macrophage or dendritic T cell microglial activation. And so if we have destabilized mast cells, it's going to be really hard to fix this dysfunctional phenotype, if you will. Now we know that the endothelial blood-brain barrier expresses histamine receptors, H2 to be specific. The astrocytes or macroglia express histamine receptors, neurons, microglia. So excess histamine dumping from destabilized mast cells can contribute directly to blood-brain barrier permeability and glial activation. Now, mast cell activation is a hard thing to test for. Tryptase as kind of the gold standard of mastocytosis. It only has half-life of like 2 to 3 hours, so unless they're in a flare, you're not really going to see it elevated in the blood. I would recommend whole blood histamine and vascular endothelial growth factor as the better markers for mast cell activation, just as a clinical pearl. But this is where sometimes we might need a little extra mast cell stabilization support. So I keep the Histoquel on hand all the time. I've got my suitcase in my room upstairs. It's allergy season back home in Kansas. The ragweed kind of gets me a little bit, so I've been popping a lot of Histoquel lately. But this is my go-to mast cell stabilization formula. Has a lot of great mast cell stabilizers, including the phytosomal quercetin, along with luteolin and others, the stinging nettle, black cumin. So all of this is to downregulate that mast cell degranulation and promote stability. Now, I do think the hormone impact on mast cells gets overlooked. So progesterone is a major mast cell stabilizer. Testosterone promotes mast cell stabilization. Estrogen at higher concentrations destabilizes mast cells. There is some thyroid impact. But I just want to throw out that clinical pearl of make sure that you're addressing the hormones as well, because how many of our clients and patients have low progesterone, low testosterone, high estrogen, so it's going to be hard to really stabilize the mast cells without also addressing that. So I know I've thrown a lot at you. This was a lot for an hour presentation, but to package this up nicely, of course, I'm all about the objective testing with some of the biomarkers that I've offered you. These are widely available through LabCorp and Quest. I've compiled them into the mental map panel so we can objectively know which physiological and biochemical domains we need to focus our intervention on first, right? There can be a lot of layers. But this is the clinical framework that I want to offer you guys on top of our foundational lifestyle medicine, is using this biphasic protocol of first and foremost, let's start fighting the fire and promoting neurotrophic activity using Cytoquel and BDNF essentials. Now let's get the mitochondria back online. We can use some ATP 360, trifortified glutathione, which you all have samples of at your tables, maybe some molecular hydrogen if you want to be extra, as well as optimizing the gut-brain axis, kind of ground zero mental metabolism, microbiota, so optimizing that diversity with core biotic in the Renew Gut Thrive, that 3-in-1 formulation. And if you need a little extra MCAS support, we do have the Histoquel as well as an amazing mast cell stabilizer. So I want to leave you guys with this. We need to spend more time tracking physiology than chasing root causes. Yes, let's explore and address the root causes, but above all else, track the physiology so you can prove to your patient that intervention is working regardless of the self-limiting beliefs that are so often trying to sabotage our psyche, right? And if any of you are interested, I have some additional resources. That QR code will take you to my additional resources. I'll give you guys a chance to scan the QR code. It goes to my link tree. So we have Holistic Savage Podcast, which is my podcast. Dennis was a guest, so check out that episode along with a lot of other thought leaders in the industry. And then we also have our FMHP curriculum. Now I have a free gift for you guys as well. So if you email free gift to info@metabolicsolutionsllc.com, that's my business, my institute, we have an FMHP workshop. It's about 8 hours of content. So if you liked this 1 hour, I think you'll love this 8-hour workshop that I put on, and I'd love to gift it to you guys just to learn more about more functional approach to medicine, functional approach to mental health. So with that, I thank you all so much for your time. I'll be hanging out here. I will also be at the Research Nutritionals booth. I'd love to chat with you guys, get to know you, your practice, and how I can support you guys, and also equip you guys with some of the best nutraceuticals in the industry. Thank you all so much.